You're listening to Inside Eyes, and I'm your host, Laura Mae Northrup. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am your host, Laura Mae Northrup. We are on episode 3 of season 2. If you are starting this series for the first time, I encourage you to go to the first episode in this season entitled Welcome Magic and start there. For anyone listening who may have questions related to the different issues and topics I am covering this season, I want to let you know that I will be doing some free online live Q&A sessions. The dates for that are going out on my email list. And before I go on, I want to share that I wrote and published a book. My book is called Radical Healership: How to Build a Values-Driven Healing Practice in a Profit-Driven World. This is a book that is essentially about what it means to be some type of healing practitioner surviving within capitalism and all the complexities that come with that. It has a lot of practical information about how to run your practice, but what sets it apart from similarly oriented books is the politicized frame and the encouragement to think very deeply about what it is that you are actually doing with your path in the context of our times. You can find it anywhere books are sold, including ordering through an independent bookseller. It is part memoir and part politicized self-help, and if you get the audiobook, it's read by yours truly. It has already sold out of its first printing, and people seem to find it super helpful. So if you like what you hear on my show, the same level of heart and intention is waiting for you in that book. If you are considering becoming a healing practitioner, or you already are one, but you want to rethink how you walk your path, check it out. Again, it is called Radical Healership: How to Build a Values-Driven Healing Practice in a Profit-Driven World. And please note, although at the time of this recording, I am a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California in the United States, this podcast is definitely not therapy. It is not a substitute for therapy, and it is not advice attuned to your specific needs. So please seek advice from a trained, competent practitioner about your specific situation to keep you as safe as possible before embarking on any healing with psychedelics or entheogens. I offer these insights in the spirit of harm reduction and education. And remember that there is sensitive content in these episodes that is not suitable for children. Okay, so on to today's topic. Sexual trauma survivors tend to have big, unmetabolized, overwhelming emotions. So let's break that down. What do I mean by big emotions? And what do I mean by unmetabolized emotions? And why is that important? When we experience an event that is traumatic, typically we are made to feel something so intense that we cannot handle it. So that could mean, for example, feeling terrified to the point that it quite literally overwhelms your nervous system. And what happens when we feel emotions like that is that our nervous system kicks into operating in trauma responses. That means things like dissociation, a freeze state, a fight response, flight, collapse, attach, etc. And some of the big emotions that sexual trauma survivors end up feeling are rage, grief, fear, disgust, and shame. If you are a survivor, you probably know what it feels like to just be overtaken by an emotion. Alternately, if you are dissociated enough, you might not even realize that these feelings are lurking below the surface. A lot of people who are chronically dissociated report feeling calm when what they are actually feeling is numb. It is possible to be low-key dissociated close to 100% of the time, or to have emotions that are sort of split off, as in they are sequestered off into a realm where you are never quite in contact with them. For example, perhaps you are angry at one of your parents, but you never feel that anger and instead just feel nothing or perhaps feel depressed. I suggest the possibility of depression here because some people theorize that depression is anger that has been repressed or turned toward the self. It takes a lot of energy to repress such a powerful and energized emotion. So much energy that you may be exhausted and deadening all of your emotions in your unconscious process of repressing anger. But back to what I was saying. Just because dissociation can be chronic doesn't mean it is a life sentence. Many people heal and come out of the chronic state. Learning the difference between being numb and being calm is a great place to start, and it comes with developing a stronger relationship to your emotions and your body. So, what I mean by big emotions is anything that is so intolerable that a trauma response is needed to cope. And that often looks like either emotional flooding or feeling out of control or feeling numb, nothing, and as though the emotions are non-existent. So back to that idea I mentioned a moment ago. What does it mean to metabolize an emotion? Metabolize means to make it usable. You know how when we metabolize food, we gain nutrients from it. We make it useful. When we metabolize emotions, we gain wisdom. Nutritious wisdom. However, if your emotions are really big and overwhelming, you might be so dissociated from them or so overwhelmed by them that you are not gaining any nutrients. You are probably just doing whatever you can to avoid feeling them or to keep them manageable so you can live your life, which is also why many trauma survivors struggle with addictions to substances, processes, or people. Generally speaking, we need something more than sheer willpower to make a feeling go away. So, what does it take to metabolize an emotion? In order to metabolize emotions, they need to be felt, expressed, and witnessed or made sense of. So I will say that again. 1, they need to be felt. 2, they need to be expressed. 3, they need to be witnessed or made sense of. We need to take them from a place where they are overwhelming, not understood, not integrated into your sense of yourself, and move them into a tolerable place where they make sense and are linked up with the rest of your experience. Sometimes people are afraid that if they feel an emotion, they won't stop feeling it. Like if they let themselves cry a little, they will just be sad forever. Sometimes that is because they will feel sad for a long time. There may be a lot of time needed to metabolize the emotion. And that is especially true when there is, say, a lot of sadness. It just takes time to move through it all. And taking that time is appropriate and normal. Sometimes people feel an emotion for a long time and it isn't resolving or ending. And that is because what you are doing is just feeling the emotion without expressing it or witnessing it. This is really critical to understand. If you just cry alone on the floor feeling absolutely terrible, that isn't going to metabolize or resolve the feeling. There is a way that feelings actually cycle through a full process and change, rather than just repeatedly overtake you. When a feeling resolves, it is like a wave. The sensation of the feeling builds in your body, then it is expressed, and then it is understood and softens. That doesn't mean it will never be felt again. Oceans always have waves, but sometimes the waves are more intense than others. Having feelings and letting them resolve is a lifelong process. Just like we eat food every day to nourish ourselves, as emotional beings, we have feelings every day that we must tend to. And for everyone listening who dislikes feelings and wants to get away from them, getting to the point where you don't have any feelings is like trying to be a human who doesn't need food to survive. It just doesn't work. We are emotional creatures by nature. But the amazing part of all of this is that once you manage to build a trusting relationship to your emotions, it doesn't need to be frightening to feel them. So let's break down the situation where an emotion is felt, but not expressed or witnessed by looking at an example. People often think feeling and expressing an emotion is the same thing. However, do you know the feeling of being anxious and it doesn't release? Right? Like you can just feel that terrible pit in your stomach or tightness in your chest where you're thinking to yourself, this is terrible, make it go away. I'm so anxious. Okay, that is feeling an emotion, but it is not expressing it. Expressing an emotion is an embodied outward process that could be big or little, but it is an embodied outward process. So that could be things like crying, shaking, breathing rapidly, laughing, yelling, or verbalizing in an emotional manner. Those are expressions of emotion. Imagine if every time you felt happy, you didn't smile, and you refrained from laughing. You might feel joy, but you would be restraining your expression of it, and that doesn't feel very good. That is the same for anger, grief, fear, and shame. It feels uncomfortable and sometimes even painful to have feelings without expressing them. And to heal trauma, we need to express whatever feelings we have in an embodied way. Whatever feelings one has related to sexual violence do not simply go away. They wait for the chance to be known. And I know a lot of people do not want to believe this, want to think that time heals everything, and time is a healer, but it does not heal sexual trauma. And looking at intergenerational patterns of abuse tell us that loud and clear. If you want to break the cycle of violence, you have to feel some hard stuff. And this might sound quite terrible, to go back to those feelings and allow them some airtime. And yes, it can be very challenging. It might be one of the hardest things you ever do. But this is of critical importance in healing, and it is an essential step toward our collective liberation. So, step one is feeling the emotion, which is easy for some people if you relate to being chronically flooded or overwhelmed by emotions. However, if you are a heavy dissociator, that will mean you have to come out of being dissociated. If the emotion is fragmented off into an unknown part of our psyche, we have to find it and get connected. Step two is expressing the emotion, which is an embodied active experience. I cannot emphasize the embodiment piece enough. People say trauma is stored in the body. Y'all, it's time to get it out of storage. We have to be willing to surrender to what our bodies need to do to express. And again, that means allowing expressions like crying, laughing, shaking, sighing, or speaking in an emotional manner. And step three is witnessing or making sense of the emotion. Attuned and empathic witnessing is a form of validation. It is human connection and it is healing. I want to be clear here, though. Witnessing can also be harmful if it is not empathic. An ambivalent or harsh witness can cause additional wounding. So with big trauma material, empathic witnessing is super important and is probably best done with people you trust, such as a close person or loving community or a vetted therapist or other type of healing practitioner. For severe trauma, it can be quite tricky and sometimes damaging to your personal relationships to seek witnessing from them. And that is because if it was severely traumatic for you, it is possible it will be a lot for the other people in your life to listen to who are not trained healing practitioners. I want to speak a little further on this because it is a huge issue for survivors of sexual violence. You may have worked up a lot of courage to tell someone about what you have experienced and how you feel about it. And the other person may say they are ready to hear about it, but they may not even be aware of how much it will impact them. Hearing about violence can have an impact on the listener. Healing practitioners do loads of work to be able to hear about and witness the impacts of severe trauma without becoming traumatized ourselves. So if people in your life cannot witness you, before passing judgment on them as emotionally unavailable, weak, or flawed, consider that they might quite literally not have the skills or capacity to hold you at the level that you need. And a big part of your healing will be being held by someone or a group of people that can really do it. Ironically, this can bring up a lot of feelings because you may really want someone very close to you to be the main support, and it can be disappointing to accept where their limits lie. But in the name of healing for all and maintaining healthy relationships with the people closest to you, this is a critical piece to consider. Okay, so back to what witnessing is. The witness helps you to make sense of the emotion and validate it. For an example, let's look at a fictional case vignette. Let's say when Melissa was 17 years old, she came out about sexual abuse she experienced a few years prior in middle school, and no one, including her family, believed her. And after she wasn't believed, she sunk into a deep depression and dissociated a ton, and tried to never think about it again. She found herself reading fantasy novels in all her free time and living in the worlds she read about more than in her own life. She attempted to make some connections with others, but really struggled to trust anyone. Then, in her late 20s, Melissa goes to therapy and says she wants to work on her trust issues in relationships. But she really struggles to understand why she doesn't trust other people. She tells the therapist that she feels uneasy sharing herself with those closest to her. To this point, she hasn't consciously made the connection to the trauma of not being believed. However, one day, about a year into therapy, Melissa comes into her session and reports seeing a movie wherein one of the main characters was sexually abused, and then shares, for the first time in the therapy, about her experience of abuse. As she reports this experience, she doesn't seem that upset about it. She says it sort of matter-of-factly and moves on to a new topic. This is dissociation. Melissa is reporting a very upsetting life event without any feelings and doesn't seem to make a conscious connection to how it has impacted her in her life. And the real feelings around it have become a fragment from the whole. It is as if the grief and pain of not being believed is floating around in its own encapsulated bubble so that it never gets felt or gets associated with the origin event. However, the therapist tunes into this moment and starts to bring Melissa's attention back there to explore it. Over time in therapy, Melissa starts to feel the emotions of anger and sadness. Then she expresses those by crying and emotionally verbalizing her pain. And her therapist, that is the witness, validates her and helps her make sense of these emotions by somehow letting her know, I see you, you feel sad and angry and betrayed because no one came to your protection or supported you in your hardest moment. And you resolved not to trust people because your trust had been so profoundly broken from the sexual abuse and the fact that no one believed you. Melissa gets to feel the emotions, know what they are about, and express them completely. And from the witnessing and making sense of these feelings, Melissa no longer has a cut-off trust issue that doesn't make any sense. She now has an integrated wound with a complete narrative and gets to experience whatever wisdom and relief comes with the processing of the feelings. For example, the wisdom she gains could be something like knowing the value of being validated in one's pain and the role that being believed plays in trust building with others. And after this experience, I'm not saying that Melissa would then suddenly trust people in her life. Rather, what may happen is that she could be more open to building trust with others, to finding out which people may be trustworthy, rather than perceiving everyone as untrustworthy, and playing out this wound with others, regardless of their actual ability to be in a trusting relationship. And it feels important to say, this is one small piece of Melissa's work toward living with less trauma. If you are a survivor doing this work, there will be many layers of healing, and a process like the one I just described could happen many times. It is possible Melissa would go through some periods of dissociation again and have to circle back around to do more integrating of her trauma, more work around not being dissociated. It is not a linear process, and it takes a long time. With smaller emotional experiences, we can do a certain level of self-witnessing. Let's say you almost got into a car accident in traffic and you became frightened, and then you pulled over and let yourself breathe in an intense and rapid way until you calmed down and had a good cry. And then perhaps you said to yourself, that was so frightening. I could have died or been seriously injured, and I'm scared because of that. That would be an example of self-witnessing. The fear mounted in the body. The rapid breathing and crying is an example of expressing and physically sequencing the emotions, and then the self-talk is a way of witnessing and integrating the experience back into the narrative of your day and self. This is also a great moment to emphasize the importance of developing supportive and loving self-talk. For someone who struggles with negative self-talk, this experience could easily be one wherein they become their own harsh witness, shaming or attacking themselves for the almost accident. Cultivating honest and loving self-talk is critical to effectively witnessing oneself. So why is all of this important? Well, having unresolved intense feelings can be quite painful. Feelings have a life of their own, and they want to be resolved. So they find a way to get your attention over and over again until you resolve them. That could be by cropping up at any moment they can find a way to emerge, or it might be by attaching themselves to situations that seem unlikely to be the true source, like I described in the vignette with Melissa. For example, when you find yourself crying at a touching advertisement, and you kind of have to ask yourself, is this cheesy ad really that sad for me? Or am I sad about grief that I've been suppressing? It could also be that your unresolved feelings keep cropping up through repetitive patterns. For example, have you ever felt as though a certain set of emotions just follows you around, almost like you are cursed? It could be that you always end up in relationships where you are emotionally unmet, or conversely, emotionally engulfed. Or perhaps you find that you always end up with friends who reject you, or find yourself cheating on all your partners and beside yourself with guilt. In each of these situations, you feel a similar set of emotions over and over. And we often excuse these patterns as some kind of mystical, unknowable process, or blame them on the world and other people. And while feelings and the psyche are quite mystical, and it does take other people's engagement to play these painful patterns out, Part of what this all is your unresolved feelings finding ways to be felt again in an attempt to resolve. But of course, many of us just suffer another round without getting to the bottom of things, only to cycle back through with the same set of feelings in another relationship. And I want to make this part super clear. Sexual trauma survivors often struggle in relationships with others, especially romantic and sexual relationships. And a large part of this is because of all the relational wounding that produces intolerable emotional states. Being close to someone is vulnerable. Sexual trauma survivors have been made to feel intolerable vulnerability in relationship to another person or persons. That makes it fairly difficult to be even-keeled about vulnerability moving forward. And often sexual trauma survivors experience replaying the sexual trauma, for example, feeling violated or engulfed by a partner's needs. While that may be happening, the partner may be violating or engulfing. It may also be the case that these are the unresolved emotional states that are finding a place to emerge in hopes of resolving by either partnering with someone who, in fact, behaves similar to a previous abuser, or by interpreting a non-abusive partner's behavior as the same or similar to the original abuse. So what I mean here is that the feelings of being violated, which is likely feelings of fear, anger, and shame, get to emerge and have a chance at being felt again in an attempt to resolve the emotional experience stemming from the original wound. But they can just as easily become new trauma and wounding if they don't get the attention they need. And they most certainly will be new trauma or wounding if the partner is in fact abusing and it isn't simply an old feeling emerging, or it is a combination of an old feeling and new trauma. Working on these unmetabolized feelings is critical to having healthy, fulfilling interpersonal relationships, and it is critical to ending the cycle of abuse and making an attempt at not accruing more trauma. And I say attempt because we ultimately don't have control over how much violence or harm we are subjected to in our lives. Choice is very political in the sense that many people don't actually have a lot of choices about who they spend their time with or how protected they are from violence. But in the places where we do have control, perhaps in who we choose as our closest confidants, we can make our best efforts to choose people who don't egregiously harm us. The key is consciously resolving feelings so that they don't have to emerge through these unconscious means. Another issue is that sometimes when a feeling is very painful, unmetabolized, and dissociated, we make other people feel it for us. This is a very unconscious process, but nonetheless, it is often what underlies abusive behavior. A classic and familiar example of this is when a person feels ashamed, but then makes someone else feel inferior and ashamed in order to make themselves feel better. We all know this dynamic. For example, someone who is insecure about how they appear might put down someone else's appearance. In the case of Melissa, we could reasonably imagine that when someone tries to get close to her and she pulls away, that they feel rejected. It is possible that she is the one who harbors the original rejected feeling. She may feel deeply unworthy of intimacy, and those original feelings of rejection from her earlier life haven't been resolved yet. But instead of her feeling the rejection, the people close to her feel the rejection. So another reason why dealing with our emotions is important is that we run the risk of hurting other people without even knowing it. And sometimes we hurt people so much in this way that it constitutes abuse. And in those instances, we have transmitted our trauma to others. They now have some healing to do. Doing your own healing work supports healthier relationships, which helps grow healthier communities, thus empowering ourselves to stay rooted in the values of liberation, rather than collectively stuck in an endless sea of unmetabolized pain, traumatizing each other back and forth. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, if you don't want to feel your emotions, you have to do a lot to make them go away. People who are surviving trauma often struggle with repetitive coping behaviors that involve substances or other types of coping processes, sometimes called process addictions. A process addiction is not an addiction to a substance, but rather a process that is done in excess. So that could be activities like excessive work, gambling, using social media, playing video games, falling in love or fantasizing, being in debt, exercise, and shopping. It takes a lot of vital life force to suppress feelings, and that can take away a lot of the life you are actually trying to live. And not always, but quite often, we cannot suppress only one feeling. If you suppress anger, you will suppress joy too. Earlier, I mentioned that people who are depressed are often quite angry, but unaware of it. Anger is a very energized and mobilized emotion that tells us about our needs, among other things. It is a manifestation of your vital life force, which is extremely powerful. It takes a correspondingly intense level of effort to extinguish something as high energy as anger. So much effort that you might feel depleted, tired, and crushed in all realms of emotion, which we then call depression. And please note, I am not diagnosing or defining your depression. This is just one way of thinking about depression. Earlier, I mentioned that if an emotion is fragmented off into an unknown part of our psyche, we have to find it and get connected. Depending on the modality a therapist practices in, this is something that therapists often help people do: find and identify the emotion. However, if you are using substances or processes to check out from your feelings, there is this tricky thing where you may have to limit or stop your substance use or the process in order to feel your emotions. This can be a very difficult step that requires a lot of trust, because not using your substance or process of choice in order to feel your feelings that you really want to get away from, requires a lot of trust that this process actually works. And for some people, this is why places like rehab make sense, or some type of environment where one is getting around-the-clock care, because it can be so dramatically destabilizing to stop limiting the feelings and start experiencing them. Stopping the use of a substance or process can also induce painful withdrawals, making the process extremely challenging. It is also often the case that when people enter into recovery, feelings such as shame and sadness can emerge about the substance use or process addiction that require attention before or in tandem with addressing the feelings that the addiction was meant to push away. This makes overcoming substance abuse and process addictions arduous and a long process. If this is something you are dealing with, know that you are not alone. People make it through all these challenges one day at a time. There are some circumstances where an individual might partake in an entheogen or psychedelic in order to change or end a relationship with a particular substance or process. I want to quickly touch on one of those medicines specifically. People who are opioid dependent sometimes seek out an experience with the iboga plant or ibogaine, an extraction of the main psychoactive alkaloid in iboga, in order to end their dependence on opioids. Iboga and ibogaine are powerful, and they also have very serious health risks related to them. If they are not administered correctly, they can be fatal. I mention them here because if that is something you are considering, please do not order it online. Do not attempt to experience it on your own, and only pursue treatment after heavily vetting the clinics under your consideration. There was a guide to finding a safe ibogaine clinic written by Juliana Mulligan on her website, innervisionibogaine.com/finding a clinic. A link is also in the show notes. And FYI, I go deeper into the process of choosing a guide or facilitator more generally in a later episode. So let's focus now on how what I have shared about feelings relates to psychedelic work. Psychedelics can at times help you feel more of your big emotions, which is incredible. But the really big thing psychedelics do is help you express more of your emotions. Often people get very focused on the visuals of an expanded state experience. And while the visuals are super cool, remember that the emotions you have and feel are also super cool. So if you go back to some of the episodes in season 1 of this series and really listen for it, you will hear that several of the interviews include people describing being able to feel more or express more, even if that isn't the same language they use to describe the experience. This is one of the reasons psychedelics and entheogens can really help people heal their trauma, because it can help them express emotions that they struggle to have access to or express in a non-expanded state. As I stated earlier, sexual trauma survivors are made to feel very, very difficult emotions. It makes complete sense that you might be dissociated or afraid to feel these big feelings. And when you prepare for an expanded state journey, a huge component is the ability to fully surrender to the experience, which is the same skill needed to fully express feelings, surrendering to the experience. Surrendering to something painful can be very triggering to people who have been made to feel profound powerlessness. So, sexual trauma survivors can really struggle with this. This is one of the reasons preparing for a psychedelic journey is so critical if you are trying to process trauma. Often when people report having, quote, bad trips, there's an element of either not wanting to or not being prepared to surrender to what emerged, and thus the experience can feel pretty unpleasant. And FYI, I will cover more on surrender later in the season when we get to the episodes about journey prep. Christian supremacy, white supremacy, and patriarchy entrain us to believe that feelings are meaningless, that they are irrational, that people who are socialized as men should only express anger, and people socialized as women should only express sadness. People who are marginalized around class and/or race are not allowed to be vulnerable, while simultaneously being forced into extreme states of vulnerability. They are often not allowed to be angry, despite being subjected to infuriating oppression. Expressing emotions is deeply political and significantly complicates the healing process depending on what one's conditioning is around having feelings. Feeling ashamed or that it is somehow weak to admit that you are affected so profoundly by an adverse experience is common due to the conditioning that we are subjected to. Some psychedelics help people feel less shame, less restriction, and less fear, which in turn can allow someone to express feelings they might otherwise feel too ashamed to express. However, psychedelics can not only facilitate a space where one might feel less ashamed, but even perhaps where one doesn't have any control anymore and doesn't have a choice about moving or emoting in an authentic way. This can be very liberating and healing. In addition, expressing feelings is an embodied process, and that can mean that your body moves in ways that aren't predictable or controlled. White supremacy and Christian supremacy both promote body-negative value systems that can lead to feeling afraid to move in authentic ways. As psychedelic medicine enters the mainstream in the US where I live, the dominant culture is accepting a pocket of experience where it is culturally allowable to move authentically and in ways that we don't permit in many other spaces. It is important to note that some entheogens do not make people feel less fear and shame, but actually turn the volume up in a way that makes the journeyer confront the feelings in their full intensity. This can be extremely powerful, but this is also a reason that being very, very prepared is essential. These medicines do not come without risks, and people can be so overwhelmed and fearful that new wounding emerges. This is also a reason that carefully choosing the guide, the medicine, the setting, and the dosage is paramount. I often say, if you think this is going to be the most powerful experience of your life, then go ahead and treat it that way. Don't rush it and don't cut corners. As you recall, first we feel the emotions, then we express them, and then they need to be witnessed. Sometimes witnessing is also a part of a psychedelic experience. For example, if you have a guide there talking with you, that person may serve as the witness. Or you may feel able to self-witness and make sense of your emotions during the journey. Often people experience that they can validate themselves in new ways. Being able to self-witness means that you value your own opinion of yourself and your circumstances as much as you value the opinions of others. This is something that can be damaged through sexual violence and other forms of trauma. So it can be quite the profound experience to allow your own sense of reality to be important and enough. And some people find that they feel witnessed by what I would call the divine or spirit, or by the medicine itself, or by other entities or ancestors that may visit them through their journey. However, if none of that happens for you in your journey, that is also very normal. And another option is to be witnessed or make sense of your emotions in your integration work after the journey. I will focus more on integration work in a later episode. A final note on witnessing and making sense of emotions. There are some experiences, both in wounding and in healing, that we never come to understand. I invite you to lean into the complexity of this. I am describing how to metabolize emotions And that does not mean that I'm proposing that all of your life experiences can be metabolized and understood, or that they should be. This is especially key to remember with regard to expanded states of consciousness, because a lot happens that is somewhat ineffable and resists meaning. While I do believe metabolizing large emotions is generally possible, that will be a nuanced and individualized process that will likely be more complex than the simple vignette I have provided in this episode. In terms of making the psychedelic experience useful in your daily life, it is important to remember that feelings happen all the time. So let's say, for example, that you are triggered by boredom, which is common for people who are survivors of certain types of neglect or severe lack of contact. And I partly use the example of neglect because neglect makes children more vulnerable to sexual abuse and is a common theme for survivors of child sexual abuse. So in your adult life, this could look like starting to numb out when you feel bored. And perhaps in a journey, you suddenly find a way to confront this boredom and build a new relationship with it, which is amazing. And perhaps you even did the feel it, express it, witness it sequence I've been describing. However, taking that new experience with boredom into your daily life is a whole other task, because you will continue to feel bored throughout your life. What this means is that now when you are bored, you have to be curious about it. You have to acknowledge it. In a sense, you have to build a much deeper relationship to being bored. And this is all slow work that helps to make the big experience with an entheogen or psychedelic something that produces lasting change. So, being able to interact with your emotions and move through your day without being triggered requires building a much more complex and evolving relationship with each of them. Earlier, I mentioned that the end result of this feeling cycle is garnering their wisdom. And in a sense, so much of what integrating an expanded state experience is taking that wisdom and imbuing your life with it. And with that, the cycle is complete. It is a cycle we do over and over again with big and little feelings. It isn't something we finish one day and don't ever tend to again. But it is possible to complete it in moments, to put something to rest, to find some peace and have some lasting change, which is a big part of what healing trauma actually is. Okay, there's so much more I could say, but we're going to leave it here for now. Thank you for joining me here once again. Please take care of yourself after listening to this episode and as you move through the whole series. If you want to support the show, please rate it on whatever podcasting app you use and consider sharing this episode with people who may benefit. Thank you so much for supporting this work. I teach occasional classes and offer group and individual consultation to clinicians around the world, and I provide psychotherapy to people located in California. If you're curious about my offerings, you can find more information and contact me via my website, lauramaynorthrup.com. And here's where I give out my social media handles, but I want to say a little something about social media. You only see what ends up being popular enough to come into your feed the days that you look at the app, an app that is controlled and censored by capitalist elites. If you want to ensure you hear about ways to work with me, learn from me, or get healing support, join my email list. I send very few emails, less than 5 per year. You can find it on my website, lauramaynorthrup.com, or there's a link in the show notes. And if you want to see memes and leave things up to social media fate, find me on IG, at @LauraMayNorthrup. And don't forget, I have a new book out, Radical Healership. Check it out, link in the show notes. Okay, until next time.